All right, so today we're going to talk more about heredity, in particular the works of Gregor Mendel. He is the father of our modern understanding of genetics, and he basically explained with his comparatively simple experiment how traits are passed down from generation to generation. Excuse me. Whether it be human, whether it be pea in his case, or whether it's plant, animal, or otherwise, there's these certain patterns that exist between generations. He was a 19th century monk, and he studied both math and gardening. He loved both math and gardening, and believe it or not, it was those two together that allowed us to understand how traits and why traits are passed down the way they are from generation to generation. So he studied pea plants in particular, and believe it or not, his study of pea plants helps us understand ourselves. So, why in his experiment, before we even get to it, why did he actually need pea plants? First and foremost, they have quick generations. You could plant a pea and grow a pea to the point where you actually have peas to sow even further within the matter of maybe a few weeks, months, perhaps. They have distinguishable traits. So, whereas for humans, even things like race, we can't necessarily narrow down to being one or the other, or height or body weight. We have a wide variety, but there are certain traits in peas that really come down to be either this or that. For instance, peas are either a yellow or a green pea color. Their shape tends to either be round or wrinkled, and they fall under these two characteristic heights as well, among other things. And then peas can fertilize sexually. The flower, for instance, of any plant is like the sexual organs of a plant. You can take the pollen of one pea and fertilize the egg portion, which is inside the flower of another plant. And just the same, they can actually self-pollinate themselves. Their own pollen can actually pollinate their own egg and their own flower. So that is something obviously that humans cannot do. So his experiment, and he did this for several different traits, but we're gonna focus on the color. I think it's easier to visualize. So he started with what he considered true breeds, and these are basically generation upon generation that he self-bred, that they self-pollinated, and they always created the same generation. I'm sorry, they always created the same characteristic. And if by chance one showed up with the wrong characteristic, he would ultimately remove those plants and probably the parents of those plants, and he kept breeding them until he was absolutely positive that this batch over here was genetically pure green and this batch over here was genetically purely yellow. And he coined this the P generation, or the pure or the parental generation. The next step is he actually cross-pollinated the batches. So he took, for instance, the pollen of a green pea and he fertilized the egg of a yellow, and he created a new generation that he called the F1 generation. So what did he notice? This is where his experiment actually started to produce some kind of results. In the offspring that we call hybrids, hybrids meaning you have parents of different traits. Their parents, for instance, were green and yellow. And he noticed that a certain trait always disappeared. In the case of color, green always disappeared. In the shape, the wrinkled always disappeared. There was always some trait that disappeared, no matter how many times he conducted the experiment. There was always the same trait that disappeared in that F1 generation. Then, to take his experiment further, he self-pollinated the F1 generation and created the F2 generation. All right. And what did he notice in the F2 generation, in the offspring of the F1 generation? Is that half of the offspring showed, I should actually say one quarter, I apologize. This should say a quarter of the offspring showed the disappeared trait in the F1 from the F1 generation, meaning that green disappeared in the F1 generation, but in the F2, one quarter of them, again, I apologize, I should say a quarter, showed up with green from the self-pollinated yellow plants. So a summary, started with pure breeds that he called the P generation. He crossed them and created the F2 generation, all of which were yellow. And then he self-pollinated the F1 generation to create the F2 generation, in which point one quarter of them were the disappeared trait. So his conclusion is that there are factors, or something we inherit from the previous generation that determines our traits, and they coined that term genes. But more particular is that there are different forms of these genes. So for instance, there is a pea-colored gene, but there are different what are called alleles. All right, so in this little chart here, eye color is a gene, hair color is a gene, but the eye color alleles would be like brown and blue. The hair color alleles would be brown and blonde. Let's say if we were to try to simplify this as much as possible. So everybody inherits eye color genes. What really matters is what copies, what versions of those genes we inherit. So the truth is that we actually inherit 2 of every gene. And this is the case with peas too. So they inherit 2 pea-colored genes. All right, so these guys probably inherited a green and a yellow. But for some reason, these guys were still yellow. These guys down here probably inherited a mixture of different alleles. All right, but again, always inheriting 2 of the 2 pea-colored genes. They're always inheriting 2 of every gene. Sometimes the alleles may be different. Sometimes they may be the same. So if certain alleles will tend to always express themselves if inherited with the other allele. All right, and he called those the dominant alleles, meaning that if you inherited that dominant allele and another allele, the dominance is what's going to express itself. In this case, yellow is dominant because these guys here inherited a green and a yellow, and the yellow is dominant, so it hides the green, what we call the recessive. The recessive will only show itself if it is inherited with another recessive allele, or if you will, green is only inherited with another green allele. So these guys down here inherited a green allele and another green allele, but these guys over here inherited at least 1 yellow allele. So going back to pea color, the dominant allele is green, the recessive allele, the dominant allele is yellow, the recessive allele is green. So remember, every organism carries 2 copies of every gene. So if this is the case, if I were a yellow pea, what would I be carrying? And the only way you could be a green pea is if you have 2 green alleles. What about this guy, though? Well, he could have 2 yellow alleles. That would make sense. But he could also have a yellow and a green. All right, so this guy's going to appear just as yellow if he has 2 yellow alleles or 1. That's how it works out. You don't appear kind of yellowish with a tint of green in this case. You are completely yellow, whether you inherit 2 yellow alleles or a yellow and 1 green. The only way you could be green is if you inherit 2 green alleles. So what has to happen is the recessive alleles must have been hiding in the F1 generation. So they're there, the green alleles are there, but they must have been hiding and being hidden by the dominant alleles. And then when the separation occurs, in other words, if these guys have 2 of every gene, these guys have 2 of every gene, these guys only get 2. So when does that separation occur? And that's when when individuals create gametes, which are called sex cells, or which are called gametes, which are your sex cells. In the world of pea plants, it's the pollen and the egg. And when gametes are made, each gamete is only given 1 copy of every gene. All right, so the pollen only has 1 copy of the pea color gene. The egg, if you will, only has 1 copy, so that when a copy is put with another copy, you have 2. All right, and if this were a sperm, for instance, a sperm and egg for humans, a sperm cell only carries 1 copy of every gene, as does an egg cell.